Today I'm going to be presenting on a staff development plan for teaching vocabulary. So over the course of this PD, participants will be able to understand the role of vocabulary within the larger framework of the 5 pillars of reading, identify components of effective vocabulary instruction, including student-friendly definitions, multiple exposures, differentiating between tiers 1, 2, and 3, morphology, word learning. We will work on analyzing data from assessments to determine vocabulary and language skill gaps, plan Tier 1 and 2 vocabulary lessons using systematic routines, integrate vocabulary supports for multilingual learners and learners with disabilities. Our agenda today is, let me move my face. I don't know how to move my face. Oh no. Sorry. The agenda is we're going to do an overview of what vocabulary is, why it's ineffective, and why it matters in terms of reading instruction. We're going to go over the components of effective vocabulary instruction, demonstrating how to teach a Tier 2 word, using data to inform instruction, and then think about our reflection planning and next step processes. What is vocabulary? Vocabulary is a student's knowledge of word meanings and ability to use words to understand and communicate their ideas. There are 3 kinds of vocabulary: receptive, expressive, and academic. CORE defines vocabulary as the knowledge of words and word meanings. Characteristics of effective vocabulary instruction are basically the same as they are for all of the pillars: systematic and purposeful, explicit and interactive, data-driven and monitored, aligned to a curriculum or text, and engaging and meaningful. Instruction must move from the most simple to the most complex in a clearly defined sequence, just like with all of the others. Characteristics of effective vocabulary instruction. Similar to the other pillars, all instruction must be, and I just read these off, and they must include morphology, so the changing of words and how that changes the meaning of the words. The sequence of learning vocabulary, we start off with word knowledge foundations. So like when kids are really little, it's just speaking, right? Like vocabulary is spoken. It's in terms of that receptive, expressive. They're not necessarily writing and reading, but even like preschoolers are building their word knowledge as infants, right? And thinking about that. So building concepts in oral language through read-alouds, visuals, discussions, teaching Tier 1 words as needed for access, especially important for our MLLs. Sometimes, you get a 5th grade student who doesn't have a ton of instruction in English, and if you don't build those foundational word concepts and teach them the explicit vocabulary, even if they have the capacity to understand what you're teaching, they're not going to gain it because they have these gaps in their vocabulary. Tier 2 vocabulary instruction means selecting words that appear across text, are important for comprehension, and that students can use in both their speaking and writing, and making sure that you're using student-friendly definitions, examples, and usages. Word relationships and deep processing, teaching things like synonyms and antonyms, categorizing, and semantic grouping, shades of meaning, and then multiple meaning words, making sure you're explicitly teaching each of those, but not introducing synonyms when you're still building the foundational knowledge, right? You use the same word, you teach that word, and then maybe you teach the synonyms of that word. But you start off as basic as possible, kind of the theme. Morphology and word parts, prefixes, suffixes, roots tied to grade level text, correct meaning, spelling patterns and pronunciations, and then you teach application of your words, right? So these are things that you're going to show how you might use different words in oral responses or within sentence frames and writing, and how you might change your vocabulary based on who you're speaking to. Those are things you explicitly teach to students. And then they reinforce them in centers and small group activities across the day and across contexts. At my school specifically, vocabulary instruction is not an explicit curriculum or practice. We start off with basic vocabulary that is commonly used in everyday conversation, and then our Tier 1 begins in grade 1 through our curriculums, our curriculums are the EL curriculum for grades 3 to 6 at my school, and the focus curriculum, which is K1 to 2nd. Both of those are very vocabulary driven, and there's a lot of implicit or explicit instruction in vocabulary built into both of those curriculums. Tier 2 is when you're doing more small group instruction, when you're noticing that kids are maybe not understanding or keeping up with the vocabulary instruction through the Tier 1 practices. You might be pulling them into Tier 2 groups and tracking to see if those practices are being supported effectively in the whole group. And then Tier 2 is more individualized vocabulary instruction, and this heavily applies to our MLLs and our IEP kiddos or our students with disabilities. I teach in a self-contained autism classroom. I am using Tier 3 instruction across a majority of my day. I'm pulling small groups. I'm working on individual goals. Even with more like Tier 1 vocabulary, when you have a student who doesn't necessarily pick up language easily or has a communication disability, it's really important that you're still starting with that like really explicit vocabulary instruction. You're just doing it at the student's individual level. Identifying students who need support. We use screeners. We use the core vocabulary screening and key phonics. We also use MAP for a lot of our screening and identifying. The other thing is like screening students' work, right? Seeing whether or not they are expanding the vocabulary. So we use these data-driven practices, but with vocabulary, there is a little bit more like kind of flexibility. We also will screen students who are MLLs in their home languages so that we can kind of understand, like, is this a language issue or is this an issue of the student not understanding the concepts, right? Some challenges of, teaching vocabulary to MLLs is limited exposure to Tier 2 academic words outside of school. In the day-to-day world, if that student is, for instance, I work at a heavily Hispanic population, like many of my students, again, and I work with a substantially separate population, many of my students are not going to be exposed to Tier 2 academic words outside of school. We work really hard. So like, for instance, my students have been working really hard on understanding the concepts of compare and contrast and understanding those explicit vocabulary terms throughout our day. We're comparing and contrasting themes in ELA. We're also comparing and contrasting our lived experiences. We're comparing and contrasting numbers in math. We are using those two terms all day and the vocabulary that relates to compare and contrast. But I am having to explicitly guide that conversation for my MLLs because they might not be hearing the words compare and contrast in the general day of like lives. And I think we also use like tied in language that is more common, similarities and differences, same or different, but really trying to explain to my students explicitly, like, this is what you're doing when you're looking at similarities and differences between things. Another challenge is false cognates or partial cognates. Many of our students, depending on their levels, will hear a word and think they know the meaning of it because it sounds like a word in their home language. And so making sure that you're being explicit in that. Another challenge is idioms, figurative language, multiple meaning words. I will argue that that's not just our MLLs, that's all of our students with disabilities as well. In my classroom, I am constantly kind of harping on the other educators in the room to make sure that, like, when we are using figurative language, we're also giving very explicit examples, right? So yeah, if you have certain students who can pick up on idioms or can understand sarcasm or can understand a simple simile, that's great. And you should be doing those things with those students, but also making sure that you are being very explicit with your students who don't have that kind of understanding. And then another challenge is morphology across languages. Our language is incredibly complicated to teach in general. The spelling, the vocabulary, things sound the same, things sound different. We have a lot of multiple meaning words or words that the meaning shifts based on what you're talking about. And so making sure that we are being cognizant. And I think a lot of this work, a lot of the work lands on us to make sure when we are planning, we are being purposeful in our planning. Some instructional supports that we can use, and I mean, my two favorites are we use student-friendly definitions, and in my class, and a practice that I have found really, really, really meaningful for my students is having not just student-friendly definitions, but student-written definitions, having the students participate in creating a shared definition of a word. So again, using compare and contrast as examples of language that I have been explicitly teaching, we have developed some practices for remembering that compare is, looking for similarities with things, because we have broken down the word into pairs, right? Things that are the same. Compare. In contrast, we're using the hard T sound and reminding kids that contrasting means we're thinking about things that are different, right? We're using that t sound to break up that word contrast, and we're talking about differences. And then we provide a lot of sentence framing. I work with a very impacted population, and so that is not just a scaffold for some of my students. Some of my students will need sentence frames, both written and oral, for the majority of their lives. And when we're talking about vocabulary, you can be taking those sentence frames and you're teaching them how to utilize them in their real life. So for instance, I can compare, like teaching kids how to use these words that we're teaching them in the real world, how they can say things, how they can explicitly build their language around the vocabulary you're teaching them. The challenges matter because multilingual learners need to be thought of explicitly. They're not the same as their peers, and I think that is so incredibly important when we're thinking about our students, that we're not just assuming that they are the same. All right, now we're going to work on how one might teach a tier 2 word, right? So we're going to do a little hands-on vocabulary routine. So at your table, I want you to pick a tier 2 word from an upcoming unit. So for me, my tier 2 word is going to be adaptation. Adaptation. And I'm going to start out by thinking about a student-friendly definition. We have talked about adapting is changing, right? We adapt our behavior to the situation. We use that sometimes in my classroom. So I'm going to start off with adapt, right? So I'm going to teach the word adapt because we have animal adaptations as our next unit. We're going to think about 2 examples of adapting, right? So an animal, grows a second coat of fur, or an animal hibernates. Those are 2 examples. One non-example would be, that like a non-example of not an adaptation would be just like the color of their fur, right? That's not necessarily an adaptation. That's just who they are. That's how they're built. So, and then you're going to think about sentence frames. One adaptation that a snake has for their lifestyle is blank. And we're going to build those out, and we're going to do that every day. And over the course of the week, we're going to be thinking about that same sentence frame. And we're probably, in my classroom, we're going to be doing repeated anchor charts, right? One adaptation of the blank is blank. And we're going to be, as we read about different animals, filling in that sentence frame every time we go. All right. After you've completed your practice and you've worked on your teaching and planning what your words are going to be, you're going to get a survey in your email. What are adjustments you're going to make in your vocabulary instruction? What routines do you want to strengthen? Are there things that you really want? So one routine that I always try to strengthen in my classroom is we try to have everything visually paired. So I include visuals of the vocabulary word. We're going to include non-examples. We're going to be, again, comparing and contrasting. We're going to be making Venn diagrams. We're going to be making word maps and walls, but everything's going to be visually available for students to draw their information from, so that when students are doing more independent tasks, they are able to utilize the visuals in the space to build those skills. All right, last, there will be chances to follow up over the next trimester. There will be coaching cycles. You'll be able to sign up to view a model lesson or for peer observations. And we are expecting at your next CPT for the grade levels to share out some of their pre-taught tier 2 words, what routines were used, and some work samples that show that your students are grasping the understanding of these words. Thank you.